Hi, friends, and good to see you back, Jayanth. How was your week?
Good to see you as well, Leslie. I was in Goa last weekend. Okay, daughter's national tournament at a picturesque location. But I had to drive back in the rain. But it was a good week and a very hectic week actually. How
Yeah,
was
so
yours?
this time around, I won't say that you were gallivanting because I know that you went on a very serious kind of errand because
Yeah.
looking after your daughter and ensuring that she's one of the top badminton players in the country is quite a task. Uh,
Yes, it's a
Yeah.
journey.
My weekend was pretty interesting. Lots of things to file as usual. You know how a journalist life is, but
Yes.
lots of developments also that we will speak about in a bit. But before that, viewers and listeners, we have a very special guest with us today. Not that all our other guests are not special, but in this specific case, it's a member of parliament. That's the reason why I use the word special, because seldom do we have members of parliaments on the AI Rising podcast. And you might be wondering why. So, Josianne Cutajar is a lawyer, politician, and member of the European Parliament of Malta, and she's also, the rapporteur on the AI Act of the Committee on Transport and Tourism, which is known as TRAN or TRAN. Now, Josiane joined Malta's Labour Party in her teenage years. In fact, when she was just 22, she's still very young, but when she was just 22, she was elected local councillor for Nadur. Among her other accomplishments, Josiane worked as a lawyer within the office of the Prime Minister until 2019. She has a Doctor of Laws degree from the University of Malta and a Master's of Law in European and Comparative Law. So, viewers and listeners, I think by now you clearly have a clue of why we have invited Josiane on the podcast. So, welcome to the podcast, Josiane, and thank you very much for being here.
Thank you very much to both
Welcome.
of you, and I really look forward to this discussion.
Okay, great. Before we get into what this rapporteur does, because I think everybody would be curious as to what your role is exactly. And in fact, actually, when we keep on talking about the European law, it's one of the most stringent AI acts that we have seen, and a very comprehensive one at that. So obviously, we will be diving more deeply into it. But before that, I think there are a lot of developments that have happened. So we'll just probably single out a few of them just to put things in perspective. So on the 13th of May, obviously, OpenAI announced GPT-4o.
For O.
Yeah, it's 4o, sorry, 4o. And O stands for Omni. So it's pretty interesting. Omni would perhaps be, the multimodal part of it. Now, the interesting part is they did it just a day earlier before the Google I/O event, trying to steal the thunder from Sundar Pichai. But what I think the industry a day later, I think so. Sam Altman announced that Ilya Sutskever was to leave OpenAI and that Jakub Pachoki would be. He already announced Jakub Pachoki as the chief scientist. Interestingly, of course, he was praising Ilya Sutskever, and I found that pretty ironical because we all know what happened in November
In
2020.
November. Yeah.
And I think Ilya was the reason why Sam was ousted, and of course, the drama that ensued. But we have spoken about the drama at length, but that's besides the point, and that's not the subject of this podcast as such. The interesting part is GPT 4o versus Gemini Pro's 1.5. Because that I think the input context window has been increased from 1 million to 2 million tokens, and GPT-4o generates tokens 2x, two times faster and
Faster.
50% cheaper than GPT-4 Turbo. Of course, it also accepts multimodal tokens. And what is interesting, when I was speaking to some of the, one of my industry colleagues, we were having a chat about how it is, expanded to a lot of languages other than English, where it has reduced it has compressed the tokens, and that I found very interesting. Of course, the third development, which warms the cockles of my heart as an Indian, is that Altman came out in praise of Prafulla Dhariwal. Who he said because Prafulla Dhariwal joined OpenAI in May 2016 as an intern. He was a research intern, and he quickly became an integral part of the team. He's one of the co-creators of several groundbreaking AI models, including GPT-3, DALI 2, Jukebox, and Glow. So yeah, a lot of developments. Your take, Jayanth?
Very interesting week, like you said, GPT-4o, and a day later, Google I/O, where in a 110-minute presentation, the word AI has been used 121 times. Okay, the kind of things that people track these days. But looking at Google literally integrated AI into every one of their products. They are looking at using their products as a huge distribution channel. But when it comes down to it, the developers still seem to like OpenAI models primarily because of API integration. That is one thing that, we can talk about LLMs getting faster, more number of tokens, better inferencing, lesser GPUs, lesser compute usage. But if they need to be built on, the API integration is, something extremely critical. And right now, I think OpenAI and Microsoft seem to be doing a better job as opposed to Gemini and Google and everything else. Looks like Google is integrating AI into all of its products, and Gmail is what, 1.8 billion users, YouTube 1.8 billion again, Android about 4 billion users. So it can AI-fy all of those products, right? And it can become a huge distribution channel for its own AI solutions. But if it wants the rest of the world to take over, then its API integration work needs to get to the next level.
Yeah, and of course, I think also when you're talking about Project Astra, when you're talking about VO and all, these are actually, in a sense, they have not been released to the public. Of course, Google's point of view basically is
that's another thing. I mean, OpenAI, in terms of releasing to the public, it looks like one step ahead, whereas the Google counterparts seem to be still in the demoware.
Yeah, but this is an interesting, because here you find OpenAI very quick on the draw, like it's like the Wild West, where the person who shoots first, gets the booty. But in this particular case, Google loves to go slow because we have Josianne here. So that's the interesting part, because somewhere they're very scared of the regulator. And since we have one of them to speak.
Yeah, before we get to our honorable MEP, this is a repeat, Leslie. If you look 10-15 years back, this is iOS versus Android. Up until Android 4.0, iOS was always ahead in terms of developments and features. Okay, Android and Google were catching up a little late, but eventually, they did, and they did better. It all depends on if you're building something to scale, or if you're trying to scale, what is already working. Okay, that's the difference.
I also think that Google is getting a taste of its own medicine, because for long it had, put Yahoo in a corner first, and then after that, Microsoft, and now
innovator's dilemma.
Yeah, it's interesting how it's going to pan out. But you always have the disruptor becomes the disrupted. So it's an interesting thing. Of course, I mean, you cannot today talk about AI and LLMs and SLMs and foundation models or anything under the sun without talking about regulation. And this is where, of course, Josianne comes in. So, Josianne, a lot is happening in this field. One, of course, if you can just tell our viewers and listeners a little about the role of a rapporteur. What exactly were you doing over there, and what was the significance of it? Because as we all understand, the European Union Act is always seen as one of the most comprehensive and one of the most stringent and a trendsetter for many other laws across the world.
Sovereign regulations around the world, yes.
Thank you very much for the question, and definitely the EU making process, it's good to explain a bit also for the audience, which audience is international, so different jurisdictions have different processes, and different also policy-making structures. And in the European Union, it is the European Commission which comes up with a proposal, and then from there, the European Parliament and the Council, where the ministers attend, the national ministers from the national governments, from the EU member states attend, put their position, and then they negotiate in the presence of the European Commission. So in trialogue, they are called to come towards a deal, which will then be voted upon again in the Council and in plenary by the European Parliament to give it the rubber stamp. And once that vote is over, then it's published within the Journal of the European Union, and then it comes into effect in line with the clauses that are stipulated in the legislation. As we know, from the time a legislation is adopted and the time it comes into effect, the periods vary. And even within the European Union, even within the AI Act, we have different implementing stages with regards to different provisions, which also give some time with regards to certain specific provisions of the Act for them to be adopted. That technology is moving on and developing so fast that we as policymakers need to keep that in mind constantly to make sure that after the whole lengthy procedure to adopt legislation, after all the consultation which is carried out, we do not lose on the fact that we do legislation which is still relevant and effective while technology moves on and on, obviously.
I think you made a very, very significant point that given the incredible pace at which technology is moving, in fact, you may, formulate a policy, and at the very second day, you might have a technology which probably, upsets every kind of thinking around that policy. I mean, look at the trademark violations, look at the IP violations,
Right.
look at the copyright violations, and look at the kind of partnerships that these big tech companies are having with publishers and with people who sort of have also accused it for the plagiarism and different kinds of acts. And of course, when you bring it down to governments and to enterprises, then it's a different thing. Jayanth, you have very closely, you have been to Malta very often, and you track also the European, all the
AI Act.
laws. We both have been doing that over
Right.
a period of time. I'm sure you have a lot of questions for.
Yes, the EU AI Act is one of the first, regional and sovereign acts, and the way they have viewed AI as a technology, its development, its impact, on the public and the society, and the business impact. Okay, is through a certain lens, and different countries, different sovereigns, view it again differently. Brazil, for example, they haven't come out with an act, but they've come up with an AI guidelines, which is fairly diametrically opposite to the EU AI Act, right? So can you you explain the process and the procedure and the overarching considerations while coming up with an act like this? Can you just quickly give a summary and explain the EU AI Act for our audience, our international audience, considering this is the very first sovereign AI Act in the world?
Yes, so the AI Act, the EU AI Act, adopts a risk-based approach. And when we say a risk-based approach, it takes into account the fact that we should regulate in line with what is more dangerous, with what might be more risky, for example, when it comes to breaching fundamental rights, when it comes to security issues like transport, for example. And I was working on the opinion that the Committee for Transport and Tourism gave to the main committee working on this AI Act. Because to explain a little, when we work on a legislative proposal within the European Parliament, we have several committees giving their perspective. Why? Because obviously, AI, for example, impacts different aspects. It impacts fundamental rights. So the LIBE committee needs to look into it. It impacts the transport sector. It's a question of security, because when we speak of autonomous and also cars or other vehicles having AI systems embedded within them, it's a question also of safety. So like some other jurisdictions, the EU AI Act also looks at a risk-based approach. And I really believe that this is important to also achieve this balance between regulating. I'm a bit biased when it comes to regulating. I'm a lawyer by profession, as also Leslie introduced me in the beginning. So I believe in legislation. I believe in rules. And I really believe that rules could give also legal certainty, which could help also innovators within the market, because it gives a clearer picture, and you'll have your mind at rest of what the rules are. Obviously, when we speak of a risk-based approach, I wanted to go a bit into it further in this regard, and wanted to give also some examples. There are some AI uses which are prohibited under the AI Act, but then there are other uses which are regulated in line with the risk. And there's the high risk, there's the limited risk, and the minimal risk. And this is, as I said, very much important. And when it comes to these aspects, it's, for example, obligations for high-risk systems. These uses include critical infrastructure, including in the transport field, education, employment, and other important aspects, such as, for example, certain systems in law enforcement, migration, border management, justice, and also democratic processes. And these are important because we need to really, as a European Union, we push a lot to protect the values which the European Union is founded upon. And we seek a human-centric approach. We seek an approach which is transparent, an approach which protects fundamental rights, including the right to privacy. We are looking at addressing algorithmic biases, because this is also an important aspect. And there are, as I said earlier on, different implementation phases which give some breathing space to also businesses and those implementing these practices in place. What I wanted to mention here, that we should not look at the EU AI Act on its own. It's important because even this act, as I said, does a lot of regulation, which gives consumers peace of mind, but it also gives businesses peace of mind. And I wanted to mention specifically here something which I pushed forward a lot in the EU AI Act through the Tran opinion, and which made it into the final legislation, that there's also free or at a minimal cost access to sandboxes when it comes to scale, to startups and also SMEs. And this is very much important. We need to make sure that within this field, even our small and medium-sized enterprises, which form the majority of the Maltese, but also the EU economy, need to have space here, because it's a question also of providing some level playing field also within the internal market, which we have within the internal market of the European Union. To explain also to international viewers, we have 4 fundamental freedoms, that is freedom of movement, freedom of services, freedom of capital, which are very much important to also SMEs, which need freedom of services and freedom of movement, freedom of capital. These 4 freedoms are important to apply to everyone. So that's why we made this important reference to SMEs, and also to try and regulate to minimize the regulatory burden to what is needed. And I really stress this point also as a member who has formed part of the SME intergroup within the European Parliament within the last 5 years. I'm looking at the provision because as a lawyer, I always carry the legislation with me. One a lawyer professor who unfortunately left this word told us one thing: do not trust your mind and memory when you are in the courtroom or when you are quoting legislation, because sometimes our mind plays tricks on us. But I also wanted to take our audience towards this, because it would be important to understand what we are doing in this legislation. And even for the international audience, I can also share with you later this act and also some aspects which I prepared, so you'll have a better idea. Because as we know, we have a lot of companies which are spread in their operations within different continents. So it's important that for those who are also based within the European Union, they will know the legislation well and how it impacts them. A lot of legislation is happening on the digital front, and this is moving on quickly along with developments. So it's important that we keep up with both. What I wanted also to refer to is that apart from the AI Act, which I mentioned, there are other supporting instruments within the European Union. There is the AI innovation package, which our businesses can tap into too, which is very much important to look into. There's also the AI office, which has been established, which will be helping with the interpretation and sharing of practices when it comes to implementing the AI Act. And then there is also the AI Pact, through which the Commission and the European Union is trying to incentivize earlier adoption of the AI provisions, even if there is some more allowance for time frame within certain provisions. This is because we really believe that having these provisions in place as soon as possible will benefit everyone.
See, I have a question on the gradations that are there in the EU AI Act. So of course, we clearly talk about the unacceptable part of it, the high risk part of it, and that which is like sort of unregulated, or which is the, let's call it the minimal risk, or whatever we want to call it. But there is a possibility, as a person who is not, in the European Union and who is doing business with the European Union, that there could have been a lot of element of subjectivity when devising these laws. And secondly, there could be a lot of geopolitical interest, so which can be, sort of interpreted as biases by somebody who's not in the European Union. What are the kind of safeguards that you folks as policymakers have taken care that, the whole process itself is not biased? Because we talk on the one side of, algorithms being biased, but even policies can be very biased because of geopolitics and because of our own subjectivity and many other things.
Yes, of course. Last time when we were speaking informally to each other, you asked me, would the next rapporteur be a voice clone, maybe? The next negotiator of legislation be a voice clone? And we were discussing this a bit lightly. So look, I believe that negotiators should be still human beings. And yet, at the cost of human beings being a bit subjective, because obviously in every process and decision making, every person brings into the discussions their also point of view, what they know, and the experiences they pass through. So as we know, as human beings, some element of bias will be there towards certain ideas or certain values. And definitely, being a European, I have certain values at heart, which I had to push for and also defend. When we negotiate in the negotiating team, there are also there's one person, one negotiator from each political party. So apart from the values of the European Union, we also bring into the discussion, I, as negotiator on behalf of the Socialists and Democrats, bring those values of my political party. And as we know, the European Union is looking towards digital sovereignty, or as I prefer to call it, digital leadership, because I really believe more in the word leadership rather than sovereignty, because I believe that a leader should be in the same at the same level as those who would follow him or her. And that leader should bring with them forward all other like-minded persons and also all like-minded stakeholders and convince them of their views. And that's how I'd like to look also at the European Union. And I really believe that the European Union needs to continue with its partnerships with different countries.
When I'm looking at when I look at the timelines of the implementation of the EU
Yes.
AI Act, I think it's some part of it. It's going to come into force from the second quarter and the third quarter of this year, with transition periods for complying with various requirements ranging anywhere between 6 and 24 months. Now that's quite a long,
Yes.
timeline. A lot could change even in the field of AI. What are the kind of provisions that you have made within the law to take care of any kind of changes that would come in this interim period?
Yes, so definitely allow me a bit to open up the legislation, the specific part on this, because yes, as you said, we have different implementing provisions. In the meantime, as I said, there is first the AI office, which will help in the interpretation aspect. Then, apart from these different implementing stages on different provisions, we also have what is called a review clause, which is present normally in the legislation, in EU legislation, which will allow also for certain revisions to happen, where after some time has passed and we have given the time for the law a bit to settle a bit, and we'll see its implementation and practices evolving, and if we need to update on that, which some review could happen under this provision too. In the meantime, on a more technical level, because also of technical developments, there is allowance for delegated and implementing acts, which will happen in a quicker method than if we were to amend the legislation through this whole process that I mentioned. So these are the safeguards that we put forward, because yes, we are aware of this. And we, as I always tell stakeholders, it's important that stakeholders from the public, the business side of stakeholders keep in touch with the policymaker to inform them of any concerns, any emerging aspects, which maybe we have a lacuna in the law, which we might need to clarify, because this constant dialogue is very much important. During negotiations, in my file, I always sought to also consult the stakeholders within this field. So this is also an important process of the policy making, where sometimes the Commission, before issuing the proposal itself, also does certain consultations, and where also myself, when I was policymaker in the name of the European Parliament, I consulted with a lot of stakeholders to listen to their views, because it's important that we also listen to the different views, and that could help eliminate subjective biases as much as possible.
Right.
Yeah. Jayanth, you have some questions.
Yeah, I wanted to make an observation. You mentioned digital sovereignty, as you would like to consider it as digital leadership. For us, people outside of EU, we would like to call that digital pioneership. EU comes up with, pioneers any kind of, digital regulations. GDPR is an extremely good example in 2017, and how it is now a norm around the world. And EU Act, the EU AI Act is also one of the first ones. So, EU seems to be pioneering. But just to summarize what the Honorable Minister of European Parliament, Josianne Cutajar, talked about, she talked about the EU AI Act being on a framework of a risk-based framework. There are acceptable risks, then there are minimal transparency, and high risk and unacceptable risks. Basis that the various AI solutions are regulated in different ways. So it's a risk-based approach. And then you also talked about the freedom of movement, the 4 different types of freedom of capital, goods, human capital, and all of that. And that also is a part of the AI Act. You've talked about the AI innovation package, which is primarily for SMEs and startups in and around Europe. And not just the horizontal AI Act. You mentioned that there are some vertical AI acts coming in, one of the workplace, one of civil liability rules and stuff like that. So, and then, the stakeholder consultation of how policymakers and regulators consult with stakeholders and take an objective view just to ensure that it's an industry wide and a very objectively set out, regulations and policies. I have one question to you as a rapporteur of EU AI Act from the Transport Ministry, right? Or from the transport section. Driverless cars or autonomous cars, right? On the risk-based, structure, where would they fall? The whole lot of AI is used in driverless cars. So, what risk, element or level would they be under?
Yes, good question. With regards to this, the driverless cars are not mentioned specifically.
Okay.
So it will depend also on certain factors. So the Horizontal AI Act really touches on it's really generic in its approach. So
Right.
it gives examples under the different risks and regulates the uses accordingly, but does not go into, for example, what a driverless car, which also has AI embedded within it, where it would fall. However, what is important in this regard is what you mentioned when it comes to two aspects. Firstly, the civil liability.
Yeah.
This legislation will be worked upon in the next mandate, but it is something that we already had instigated the Commission to do, because as Parliament, we can instigate the Commission to act upon a certain topic and develop legislation. And here we did what is called an own initiative report, where I worked upon from the Trump perspective. And this is important even when it comes to driverless cars as to who is liable. Was it the person who developed the AI system? Was it the manufacturer of the car? Was it the owner? So there are all these aspects which the Product Liability Directive, which regulates at the moment these liability when a product defects and causes harm, does not sufficiently address.
I will have to butt in here in the interest of time. Josianne, I think we will have to call you on another podcast, because it's such a critical kind of, piece of legislation, and the impact and the import for the world itself is so much. So,
and I think we just started understanding it. Yeah.
I know.
Yes.
But before we conclude, I would like you to give two pieces of advice very quickly to sort of companies that are outside the European Union and who have a lot of cross-border transactions and who sort of want to do work with the European Union. What are the kind of 2 or 3 things that they need to keep in mind?
Yes, first of all, I think that the European Union, the way it has led with certain legislation, and we're working on a plethora of different digital legislation, which we might touch upon in another podcast, because there's so many digital legislation that we worked upon within this mandate, and I'm sure it will also go into the next. So definitely it's important to understand the legislative regulatory framework of the European Union, because they need to know about the rights and obligations. But to compensate on that, the obligations might sound heavy. But with the obligations, there are opportunities for this priority access to sandboxes, as I mentioned. There's also the AI innovation package, which they can tap into. And there are a lot of other EU funds, including under the Digital Europe program, Horizon Europe, which they should also look into, because definitely the EU funds are key. And while the EU is regulating maybe stricter than other continents, the positive side to it is that there are also the aspects such as, for example, peace of mind to customers who are also looking at products and technology, including AI, which is developed in a way who does not breach their fundamental rights. At the end of the day, businesses depend on consumers too. And it's important that within this field, consumers have peace of mind and they have trust in the products and the services which are developed and which use AI embedded systems.
Thank you, Josianne. You've given us some real valuable tips that
Yes.
businessmen and companies can take home. Of course, we will. I mean, thank you very much for your time, because we know that you keep a very hectic schedule, and we hope to get you back on this podcast when the implementation is being done, so that companies, business people, and our viewers and listeners get a much better idea of where it has reached and what are the kind of complications and how they can turn around. On a lighter note, of course, somebody can develop an LLM to run through the entire European AI Act and probably summarize it and try to make sense of it. But of course, that's on a lighter note. Jayanth, thank you, and of course, we'll be catching up with you. Have a lovely weekend, and Josianne, wish you also a very lovely weekend. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Josianne,
Josianne.
and to all. I hope that you'll find it interesting. I try to simplify as much as possible, but yes, definitely. Thank you for this opportunity to also share with the international audience what we are doing at European level.
Yes.
And I'd really be interested to listen to future podcasts, to listen also to what other continents are doing. I read a bit into it, but it's great listening firsthand from people who have worked on the different frameworks themselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.